So speaking of legislation and speaking of speakers, I'm really pleased to welcome back today Jim Anctil, who is the owner of Marie's Movers. Jim, as I told you a few weeks ago, won a Community Service Award for the work that he does from Safe Haven of Waterbury, where in that role he works with women and families who've been displaced by domestic violence, and for that work he was recognized with the award. He also helps refugees find housing and helps establish them into their new lives. And he employs several people who've been released from incarceration, including Ronald Ricks, who spoke here so well a few weeks ago. He is the gentleman who from the age of 16 to 40 was incarcerated, and during that time wrote children's books. So his employer is Jim Anctil. Jim this week, and you know that often I hound people to speak. Jim raised his hand, kind of. So thank you, Jim. Jim sent me an article and said this is an eye-popping podcast regarding race and property in the Northeast. And I invited Jim to speak here today, so please welcome back to Justice Southbury, Jim Anctil. Thanks, Jim. Right into the microphone. Thanks.
Okay. How's that? Okay, good. Okay. This takes about 13 minutes, so you know where the finish line is. On the evening of July 9th, I received a call. Oh, let me put my glasses on. On the evening of July 9th, I received a call from one of my employees, a Sudanese refugee who'd been working for me for the last 3 years. He was asking for $750 in cash because his landlord was demanding immediate payment of his July's rent. I gave him the money and reluctantly got involved in his housing problems. In June of 2020, he, his wife, and 3 children had been placed by a sponsor group in an apartment in Danbury. Danbury rents increased dramatically over the course of the lease, so in May of 2021, his family moved into a condo owned by one of the members of the sponsor group. He paid a below-market rent of approximately $1,800 a month, which was more than he can afford. He barely managed to stay current, but was asked to leave at the termination of his lease in May of this year. I was aware of the struggle that he was having to find an affordable apartment, but I had managed to stay out of it. His phone call brought me back in. I quickly formed a relationship with his realtor and started to attend his apartment viewings with him. He's black, and at our first viewing, when I got out of the car with him, the father of the prospective landlord asked me, "Are you the one who's interested in the apartment?" I said, "No, this man is." When he put in his application with the realtor, he was told that the apartment that was listed as being available on August 1st was no longer available, as the landlord was now waiting until after the 1st to make a decision. This experience reminded me of a This American Life podcast that I had heard years ago. It's called House Rules, and it's a detailed history of the passage and the first years of implementation of the Fair Housing Act. I live in one of the first suburban neighborhoods in Naugatuck. It was built in 1946 and occupied by families of World War II veterans benefiting from the GI Bill. About 10 years earlier, FDR had started the policy of federally backed loans for middle-class people. These loans started the practice of redlining. The red line refers to the color on the map where black neighborhoods were outlined and where federally backed lenders were not allowed to lend. They were also not allowed to lend to black people who wished to purchase a house in the more desirable neighborhoods. I've brought a map from the 1930s of Waterbury, which shows the designations of its neighborhoods for lending purposes. The federal government intentionally excluded black people from my neighborhood, and the man who excluded them was the hero of American socialist policy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. By 1964, many people's attitudes towards race had changed. When President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which banned state racial segregation In the South, many of his supporters were eager to follow it with the Fair Housing Act and end property segregation in the North. However, the act failed to pass in 1966 and 1967 due to its opposition by Northern liberals, who were not as keen to vote on civil rights legislation that would affect their states. It was only after the assassination of Martin Luther King that the bill finally passed in 1968. The irony of racist liberals was irresistible to the 60s counterculture. The folk singer Phil Oakes wrote a song titled "Love Me, I'm a Liberal," which mocked their contradictory views. The pertinent verse to the Fair Housing Act goes, "I cheered when Humphrey was chosen, my faith in the system restored. I'm glad the commies got thrown out of the AFL-CIO board. I love Puerto Ricans and Negroes as long as they don't move next door. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal." Malcolm X put this contradiction into a blunt analogy. He said the American black man only needed to choose which one to be eaten by, the liberal fox or the conservative wolf, because both of them would eat him. In the wolf's den, I'd always know where I stood, whereas I might be lulled and fooled by the smooth, sly fox. Not surprisingly, Phil Oakes' song starts with a liberal's opinion of the assassination of Malcolm X. Meanwhile, George Romney, the Republican governor of Michigan, had become a leading proponent of the Fair Housing Act. He had to call out the National Guard to quell the race riots in Detroit, and instead of blaming the participants, as many of his supporters did, he blamed inequitable housing conditions, which caused the problem. Because of his prominence on the issue, the new Nixon administration appointed Romney as secretary to the newly formed Department of Housing and Urban Development. Nixon himself was vehemently opposed to what he called forced integration, while Romney was fervently opposed to housing segregation. What Romney ended up doing was threatening to cut off federal housing dollars to municipalities unless they were willing to open themselves up to people of different races. He did this without the support of the administration and was successful for some time until a case with the city of Warren, Michigan got press and the president found out. What followed was Romney's unofficial resignation letter. Now 55 years have passed, and the upper Midwest and Northeast are still segregated. Connecticut is one of the most racially segregated states in the country. More than 2/3 of black and Latino residents in Connecticut live in only 15 of the state's 169 cities and towns. In 2021, the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities published a report on the discriminatory effects of zoning laws in the state. I read the report in order to prepare this talk, and it's the source of many of the facts and statistics that I cite. It's filled with pages of state legal history and graphs that explain what anyone who drives from Southbury to Waterbury can plainly see. Waterbury is full of multifamily homes and apartment buildings, and Southbury is full of mid-sized and large single-family homes on large plots of land. Living in Southbury is financially out of reach for the majority of residents of Waterbury. If you compare the racial makeup of Waterbury with Southbury, Waterbury is 38% white, while Southbury is 86% white. Middlebury, the other town in the Region 15 school district, is 90% white. Southbury and Middlebury have zoning laws which create what's called a disparate impact. In other words, while the laws are neutral on their face, they have a statistically significant impact on different groups. The best solution that Connecticut municipalities have come up with in order to comply with the Fair Housing Act, as well as the state's laws and litigation on the issue, has been affording affordable housing development subsidies for the developer and tenant-based vouchers for the occupants. If you look around, these haven't worked so well. They are both famously rife with abuse by the dishonest, but they also have inherent flaws which make them ineffectual for their honest recipients. The biggest flaw is that affordable housing developers are discouraged from investing because the subsidies rarely compensate them for the months or years of legal battles that they face with municipal planning commissions. Litigation statistics from 2010 to 2020 show only 69 cases have been brought on the basis of the Affordable Housing Appeals Act, which is Connecticut's fair housing law. It's almost like a bad joke. How do you turn a bunch of conservative Republicans into staunch socialists? The answer is exclusionary zoning. They may vote for candidates who want to dismantle every federal regulatory agency, but challenge their local zoning laws, and up come the lawn signs, out come the petitions, and everyone gathers together to sing a hymn to the sanctity of regulation at the town planning meeting. When I was a child, I used to watch the Lost Cause movies like Gone with the Wind and Song of the South that Hollywood made to romanticize the days of the southern plantations. They showed images of oak-lined carriage drives leading up to beautiful classic revival mansions. I would think, how could something so beautiful have been that bad? If you drive through the hills of Connecticut, you can see similar residential scenes. These views are beautiful, but when you think that they are created by zoning policies designed to make sure that certain people can never afford to live there, it does bring up some racial connotations which are comparable to those of the Deep South. The Zoning and Discrimination Report came up with a list of recommendations to end housing segregation in Connecticut. The first is more project and tenant-based vouchers. This recommendation is in the same report where they quote Desmond Tutu, who said there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they are falling in. I personally agree with his metaphor. I think that voucher programs and other policies like affirmative action are essentially Band-Aid solutions to a problem that conservative wolves and liberal foxes don't want to fix. These solutions pull people out of the river, but don't stop them from falling, or more truthfully, being pushed in. 4 of the 11 recommendations directly address exclusionary zoning. Eliminate zoning bans on multifamily housing and accessory dwelling units. Eliminate excessive requirements for lot size, setbacks, height, parking, and density. Regionalize education funding to distribute education resources more equitably. When building new developments in communities, require a mix of housing types, for example, single-family, townhouse, garden apartments, so as to attract a diverse mix of income levels. The third one is the least likely to be implemented. In spite of Sheff versus O'Neill, in spite of Connecticut's racial imbalance law, how many white conservatives or liberals in Middlebury would consider regionalizing with Waterbury, or even Naugatuck for that matter? How many of the same people applauded the Supreme Court's recent decision to require Alabama to redraw their gerrymandered district maps? How many condemned the decision on affirmative action? The fact is that implementing even one of these 4 recommendations could be the beginning of the end of housing segregation in this state. The question is whether white people in the suburbs will ever be willing to disrupt the most precious part of their lives, their homes and their children's education, to do it. The first step is acknowledging that their situation in life has less to do with their hard work and more to do with generations of their families playing a game where the rules favored them while pushing blacks and Latinos into Desmond Tutu's river. To go back to what brought me here, we were able to find an apartment in Naugatuck for my employee and his family that he and his family can afford. It's one of 6 in a multi-family tenement house. The neighborhood is full of children who play outside, and they all look like his kids. In Naugatuck schools, they aren't that bad. The family has found their place in Connecticut.